You're listening to the Running in Production podcast, where developers and engineers talk about their tech stacks, lessons learned, and general tips from running web apps in production. Here's Nick and today's guest. Welcome to Running in Production. Today I'm with Dan Bader, who runs RealPython.com, which is a massive learning resource for anyone looking to learn Python. The site itself is powered by Django, which is a web framework written in Python. Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Super happy to be on the show, and I'm excited where you're taking this podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Do you want to start off by introducing yourself and letting people know a little bit about RealPython?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Dan Bader. I run a website with Python tutorials and video courses and other resources like interactive coding challenges, quizzes, stuff like that. That's called RealPython.com. And I think we're definitely among the largest sites. Like, I can't actually think of another site that has so many publicly available, like, free tutorials out there. That is not the official documentations or something like Read the Docs. So we're getting about 2 million unique visitors a month. Comes down to like 4.5 million page views according to Google Analytics. And so we try to spread the gospel of Python essentially with this site.
Yeah, no, you guys are doing a great job. It's pretty crazy. Like, every time I Google for like a specific Python problem, it's either some Stack Overflow answer or like a massive blog post on your platform.
Sweet. That's great to hear. Yeah.
So I don't know that much of the history behind RealPython. Did you like take over that site, or did you develop it from scratch?
Yeah, that's right. So the history of the site has been, so it was run by another team. It was initially started in 2012 on the back of like a Kickstarter campaign. And where the previous owners, they did, they created a Python book or a series of Python books, and then also needed an associated website. And I believe that's the reason, like, why it was started initially. And that was back in 2012, or I think like late 2012. And so I came in. So I'd been doing some, I've been building sort of. I wrote a programming book about Python, which is like basically like a bucket list item, like lifelong dream kind of thing. And that book is called Python Tricks, and it did pretty well. And I wanted to do more, and I felt like it wasn't really possible to, like, doing this under my own name felt like the wrong way to go about it at a certain point, because I wanted to involve other people. And then, do you want to write for a site that's called danbader.com, or do you want to write for a site that, sounds like it's more like a legitimate entity out there? And so, anyway, like we started chatting with the old previous owners of RealPython.com, and I ended up taking over the site in 2017, and or at the end of 2017. And back then it was still hosted on PHP as a static site essentially. And since then I tore all of that down and rebuilt it from the ground up using Python, Django. So we have a proper CMS, we have an account functionality, and all of those things that we can talk about at some point in the show.
Nice. Yeah, I wasn't really sure if you took over an existing Django app or if you did it from the ground up, but now we know it's from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
So was it just you who initially developed the site, or do you have like a small team?
So I'm still the sole developer on that. I'm hoping that that's going to change soon, because I feel like I'm the bottleneck for a lot of things. And so basically I started with an empty project, and then pip installed my way to the current like CMS that we use, content management system, and that's all built on top of Django. And actually using Django is just has just been a super happy experience for me for that specific purpose. We're not running into any issues with performance, and it's been like a very enjoyable development experience, especially if I'm the only person working on the code. I'd rather like use something that makes me feel really effective and gives me a lot of stuff out of the box. And it to answer your question, actually, it literally started with an empty project, and previously was just a bunch of like static HTML hosted behind Apache. And I wanted to have some more, I don't want to say like advanced features maybe, but I wanted to do things like, wouldn't it be cool if we had interactive quizzes on the website there? Or wouldn't it be cool if we could, maybe personalize your like recommendations for articles and courses you should check out? Or like back then we didn't even have courses hosted on the site. So that's something that happened at the start of this year. So now it's actually like a complete learning management system where you can take courses, you can watch videos, you can mark them complete, you can bookmark them, you can get completion certificates, and it's now like a much more like holistic experience. Like when I started, the first piece I worked on was just, we're rendering out articles that are internally written in Markdown, and we want them to look nice and have for our users to have a fast experience when they're reading our tutorials.
So before we go into a little bit more details about the app itself, are you running the latest stable version of Django?
Yep, that's right. I might be. I'm checking my requirements file here right now. I'm on 2.2.4, which I think is. I think there might be like a 2.2.7 now. Maybe I shouldn't say this publicly. There's probably some terrible security issue there that's exposed there. Just kidding. But yeah, that should be the latest stable. And actually, the Django 3.0 release candidate just came out, and I've been staying like pretty close to the updates there. And yeah, I'm guessing we'll be upgrading to that at some point in 2020 when the 3.0 final release comes out.
Nice. So are you also running, did you upgrade to Python 3 or are you still running 2x?
This is on 3. So I started out on Python 3 from day one. And I believe it was also Django 2.0. Maybe it was one of the betas still. But yeah, basically started with a blank slate, Django 2. And in Python 3, and I think it was 3.6 at the time, and now we're on like 3.7. I haven't upgraded to 3.8 yet, but yeah, I try to stay pretty close to whatever the latest version is there, because yeah, as you probably know, it just gets harder if you're a couple of versions behind. Then it just becomes like a week-long project to update dependencies instead of ideally like a couple of hours or just a couple of minutes. And so yeah, try to stay pretty close to that. And also it gives me like a lot of like personal enjoyment because I get to play with the latest and greatest version, which, my sort of previous experience, if you're working for a company, sometimes there might be other kind of restrictions, what you can use or what other developers agree on or not agree on. And so it was like a nice little piece of freedom to be able to always run like the latest and greatest there.
Yeah, that's always a very scary situation when you don't touch your requirements, that text file for a year, and then you try to upgrade. Yeah. I'm actually finding. I'd be curious how you manage that, because I know you run your own infrastructure as well for your tutorials and courses. Like I found the GitHub, the what's it called? It used to be Dependabot, I think, and then GitHub bought them, and now it's like an integrated feature into GitHub where GitHub will just tell you, hey, this is an outdated package. Here's a pull request that bumps that package to the latest. And so if you have a test setup and like a CI setup integrated on GitHub, I can just directly see, okay, this pull request, it looks like it didn't break anything in the test, so I have like a pretty large like suite of unit tests there, which I think is super important especially if you're doing this alone. There's like no QA or nothing. And I found that like an incredibly helpful tool because I'm always at least like peripherally aware, like, oh, there's 5 pull requests waiting for me. I should probably check them out and just merge them in if everything is okay. And yeah, I was just curious if you're using something similar or if you're what your workflow is there. So for updating packages, I still go the manual route where just, I try to keep a pulse on the community, but yeah, every couple of weeks I just go in there and take a look at what's new, and then just, individually either upgrade one package or a couple if it looks like, it wasn't a huge change, like, like a major version or something like that. Yeah, less stressful that way, I think, because the downside of having the automation there is that you always have something waiting for you, that demands your attention every time you go into your GitHub or code repository. But yeah. Also, I think too, it's like, well, sometimes it's like just because a new release is out and stable, it doesn't necessarily mean, it's like ready for production. Like it might be from the library author's point of view, like he hopes it is or she hopes it is, but sometimes it's not. So I'm always a little bit scared to jump up versions unless I have like a real need. But at the same time, yeah, you can't just ignore it for a long time. Otherwise, it becomes almost impossible. You end up like rewriting your app after like 2 years.
Yeah, exactly. That is like I feel like that's the big nightmare scenario that I want to avoid. That at some point you're looking at this and you're like, okay, we could basically rewrite this from scratch. But yeah, I agree with you. Like if you're always on the bleeding edge, it could also be a great way to hurt yourself. And so I also try to strike a balance. I mean, that's the reason why I'm not running Python 3.8 right now in production, for example. It would probably be fine, but I don't really need any of the new features right now for this app. And so I'm just gonna hold off for a while and then upgrade at some later point.
Right. So speaking of your app, is it a monolithic application or do you have it broken up into like microservices?
It's pretty monolithic. So, I mean, I run a couple of other sites as well. For example, the pycoders.com Python newsletter. And then there is, we have this like feedback tool that I use on RealPython.com. So if somebody wants to give feedback on a course, let's say, and we've also got that integrated into the books, at least the digital versions. They all have a feedback link at the end of a chapter. And so that's a separate app, more like a, it's not really like a service, but it's more like a standalone, like, second Django app. And I'm actually walking back on that. I think it's for what I'm doing with just me or a very, very small team, I think Monolith is the way to go. Just because, updating 5 apps is more challenging in my experience than just kind of having it all in one go. And I know there's different scenarios, and so it's purely speaking from my perspective and talking about realpython.com. So I think like doing microservices is more like sort of like well, it's an architectural tool, but it's also like something that it depends on how the organization is set up. So it's almost like an organizational tool. I think if you have a company that where there's 500 developers and they all need to coordinate in some way, then I think that's a really powerful solution to go with a microservices approach. But I think if it's just one person or a very, very small team, for me, it's been beneficial to have it all in one monolithic app.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So most of my applications are monolithic as well, because it's like, you're not Google unless you're Google,
Mm-hmm. And you'll know, when the time comes, like you'll probably have the resources and to change things.
Right. So in terms of your monolithic app, I mean, do you happen to know like roughly how large the app is, like lines of code, like files across your project? Estimates.
I could probably give you a real answer. There's this tool, what's it called? Slock count.
Yeah.
Just run that if I have it installed. If not, I'll install it and we can run it later. But I'm very, very curious myself. I'm
not really, like a Django professional. So I went through the old, what was it, like the voting app tutorial back in the day, and I know my way a little bit around it. But so while you're trying to figure out the lines of code there, like how many Django apps do you have in your app?
Let me check here. I would say about 10.
Can you give an example of, maybe rattle off a couple of names for those apps?
Yeah, sure. Let me pull that up. So we're at around 19,000 lines of Python here, and then plus, HTML and all the other stuff that would be in there. Yeah, that's just like roughly the size. And then as far as apps and whatnot go, drum roll. So some have broken things down. For example, I have sort of like a core app that's called a blog, and it should probably be called something different at this point, but I haven't renamed it yet. And that's kind of driving all the rendering and all that stuff for the written articles. And it has like the core model for, these are topic categories, and this is how they relate to individual articles. And if you pull up like a written tutorial on realpython.com, which is the main type of content, then this app will take care of it. Another app, right next to it alphabetically, is called certificates, and that's for completion certificates. And so it has like all the endpoints for the permalinks for the certificates and the validation and the models for that. And of course, I also have a common app that isn't really an app, as it's just kind of like a package for me to throw in a bunch of like shared code, some utilities in there. yeah, that sort of thing. Do you want to hear more?
I think that's okay now, only because like if you went down the whole list, then I don't think we'll ever finish the podcast.
Yeah, it would take a while.
Which I wouldn't mind at all, but I know you have like some type of constraints on time.
Yeah. Actually, I think I said 10 apps, right? But I'm actually surprised it's more. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's more like 20, 23 in there.
Wow. So just like high level stuff, like user authentication stuff, like payment gateways, like these things are all broken out, I guess.
Yeah. So I have like a store app, or I have like a members app to handle the subscription workflows and stuff like that. Like sometimes the challenge obviously with this stuff is when you break it down, you make a best guess effort at least for me. And I'm like, okay, like what does make sense? Okay, we want to do video courses on the site, so there's a videos app. Turns out now, a course is could be much more dynamic than that. So it could have textual elements. Now, actually, the books that we're selling, they're also courses internally, and so now they're not videos, and so it doesn't really make sense for this app to be called that way. But kind of if you break down the sort of domain, it still makes sense I think for these things to be lumped together. But now I'd have to go back and like rename it, and call this like courses or products or something like that. And I find like that is always like a moving target. You're never like fully there, or it's not. Let's just say it's not immutable. And what I like about Django is that it allows me to shift around things. And if I start out writing some apps, at least I have a structure in place that allows me to break down things into sub packages and kind of keep them separate. And even though if I'm probably not going to get it right the first time, I have a way, or I have my app set up in a way where it's not super painful to then go in and make these refactors. I mean, it's still annoying. It's a lot of times you don't want to do it. That's why my app's still called videos in there. But I like that about Django. That was at least directionally, pushing me into that towards that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good framework feature to do that because, like you say too, right? It's not immutable. It's always going to change. And like, there's no way you can ever think of like the perfect name before you get to writing the actual code and figuring out what it should be.
Exactly. Yeah. I agree 100%.
Like, for instance, I don't want to go too deep into this, but like I just broke out like promotions as being its own like type of app, not a Django app, but like it's its own thing. And it has like discount codes and price parity and all this other stuff. But I didn't come to that originally. Like it took quite a while to get there.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like a lot of times in the beginning, you just don't know what features people need. Like, I mean, my philosophy the whole time with this stuff has been, because I'm the sole developer on this thing, I want to ship. I always want to be shipping, and then I want to ship like a minimal version of a feature and see if things get traction, and then add more stuff to it. So, I think then similarly, like it just naturally happens that way, where you have like a minimal version of something. Maybe you probably didn't have that promotions app in the beginning, right? Or like this promotions package, and then over time you're like, oh yeah, this would be really cool, and now we've run like another sale or something, so it really makes sense to lock this down in a better way. And so it's been, yeah, I think that's the only way to do it. I mean, a lot of times I wish there was just a way to look at the crystal ball and be like, okay, here's the perfect like breakdown of the app. But I mean, if waterfall and like the failures of the failures of the waterfall model have taught us anything, it's pretty much that's not really possible in software. So I think we're stuck with iteration and improving things over time.
Yeah, totally agreed. So these apps themselves, are you using like server render templates with like little sprinkles of JavaScript, or is this like API based with some JS heavy front end?
It's all server side templating, which I think for like a news site, or at least for the types of content that we have there for the tutorials, makes sense. And then there's some like dynamic parts sprinkled in there. I think like for some other things, I would probably do them differently now. For example, the quizzes, I think that those would be like a great example of something that probably should be like a single page app essentially, or like a sub app. So I'm not like fully like bought into the model of like, oh, the only thing you ever have is like an index.html file, and then it loads a bunch of like JavaScript, and that should then take care of everything. I think that there's apps where that makes sense, but I think for RealPython.com, I would probably always have like a mixture of approaches, and rely heavily on server-side templating, just because I feel like it's making me very efficient in terms of being able to iterate quickly and code stuff. And now I'm just a lot more proficient at Python than I am at JavaScript.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I'm fully on board with that style as well, because it's like, yeah, you're just displaying like documents basically, and server-side rendering. You get the SEO without having to jump through hoops. It's a nice setup.
Yeah. I mean, Django was specifically built for that kind of use case. It was initially built for a news website, so actually journalistic reporting, and I forgot which one it was, but that's sort of its origin, and it just seemed like a really, really good fit. Like what I like the most about Django specifically is that you get a pretty big admin area for free. So you can just tell it like, hey, here's the models, here the fields that can be edited, and then it'll scaffold an admin area where people can go in and make changes, and you can have permissions handling and all of that stuff. And I found that incredibly helpful, especially initially as I was bringing on more people, being able to just have a workflow there that could be codified and it could be built into the app, and then being able to just give people access to their own blog posts. Or then if we build more trust over time, then maybe somebody could also start editing other stuff. And I found that very, very helpful, and didn't have to build that stuff from scratch.
Interesting. So you are using the built-in admin then for all of that?
Yep, pretty much. Yeah, for setting up courses, the quizzes, all of that stuff relies heavily on the Django admin. I have some like custom views in there as well, or it's pretty extensible too. So I have like custom validation rules and some like checks in there. Yeah, that's been working great. I mean, it's not the prettiest. That's kind of the downside of it. But for our use case, I think it's a great balance.
Yeah, totally. So I'm pretty much the same way. It's like the admin in most of my personal apps are very, sometimes they're not even existent because the frameworks I use don't have that built in. So oftentimes, sometimes I don't even have an admin dashboard, and I just use pSQL on the command line to do some monkeying around with the database. But that gets old pretty fast sometimes.
Yeah, but it could get you pretty far, right? Like, I mean, one thing that I do sometimes, I'm using, so I'm hosting this all on Heroku, and so I'm using the the hosted version of Postgres there as our database. That Heroku provides. And so it's pretty cool. Like you get a dashboard there where you can create these things called data clips. So I could write a query in SQL and then store it in there, and I can use the Heroku dashboard to rerun that query if I wanted to pull some stats. I mean that is not like a super scalable way to do things, but it's good enough a lot of times, right? If it's a one-off thing, then I can do that, and I can also give access to other people that way. And I found that kind of thing really powerful. And I mean, having some local script there that you just run from the command line, that is exactly the same thing essentially. And I do that a lot too. Where I have all kinds of like one-off import things, or just one-off scripts that I would just run from the command line.
Yep, I love it. And that's a pretty cool feature of Heroku. I actually didn't know about that. So before we move on to the rest of your tech stack, there is one more thing I wanted to cover. Are you using any type of WebSockets, or what is it in Django? They have like a channels feature now, I guess, or maybe you had it for a while?
Yeah, so that's right. It's called Django channels. I believe it's something you have to install separately. I'm not sure if that's going to change with 3.0. But I personally, I don't use any kind of WebSockets features, just because that app didn't have the need for it until now. But yeah, you can definitely do it with Django. Yeah.
Nice. So then, for the rest of your stack, I mean, I guess number one is are you using Docker or no?
I'm using Docker locally, so I have a compose file that spins up an environment that is the same environment that I'm running the app on in Heroku. So I can just go spin that up and then boot my Python app locally in my virtual environment. And it's going to find the same version of Postgres, going to find the same version of Redis, which I use for caching. And I use it for local development. I haven't Dockerized the the main app. So I essentially run this like at the just in like a local and virtual environment in the project folder. And the reason I've been doing that is just the performance difference. And I don't know, maybe it's a lot better now, but like I got annoyed with the delays in auto reloading when I had it packaged in a Docker container. And I think a lot of it has to do with like the Docker implementation on macOS. I hear it's better on other operating systems. But long story short, I use Docker mostly for local development and testing. Okay.
So in testing, you're just building, that's the environment that all of your stuff gets run under, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's right. And then, so when I test locally, and then also the unit tests run inside a Docker container, I'm using Circle CI. And so again, I have the same environment, the same versions of Postgres and all of that pinned down. So we're talking to the same version there in production. And so I have two ways of running the tests. Like one, I could spin them up locally where it's all Dockerized, also the Python apps running inside Docker, or I could run them just in the local virtual environment at sort of the top level. Like if you're thinking Inception stacks of like containers within containers, or it's we're at the base level of reality on my computer there, and right. So gives me some flexibility. A lot of times, like I wish, especially when I'm thinking about bringing on other developers there with this app, I think I'm going to Dockerize the whole thing and basically write our instructions as if you're doing local development, here's how you do it with Docker, and that should be the default go-to, because then we can just make it easier for all of us to pin down the same versions, and it's just easier for someone to get set up with the app locally. So again, it hasn't been a problem for me because I have my dev machine here, I have backups, and I have everything set up, and it's a comfortable setup for me. But I think if we were working on this stuff with a larger team, I think I would probably default to Docker, because it's just gonna get rid of all the headaches of like, oh, but it works here, and like I've got this version of, oh, did you update your requirements? And we could just get rid of all of that and just have it automatically rebuild the container, install all the dependencies.
Right. Yeah. In a perfect world, it would be just basically like a Docker Compose up, and then in 10 minutes, everything may work on every operating system.
Yeah, that'd be beautiful. Yeah, that's the goal for sure.
So earlier you mentioned that you're using Redis and you have some caching set up. Are you also using Celery?
I'm not using Celery. I'm using a library called Huey, like Huey. Yeah, it basically it allows you to spin off tasks that run on a one or more worker processes, and so that way I can, if I have something that talks to an API or something like pulling analytics or something like that, I can do that on a different process and not block the web server or the web app server. And Huey is sort of like a lighter weight version of Celery. And I think anytime you say something like that, or like I say something like that, I feel like, okay, there's a reason it's lighter weight, because there's a lot of stuff in Celery that at some point you're probably going to need. I've been pretty happy with Huey. I think there's some things. I don't know like how much you want to go into this, but it's cool that it's a lot smaller, like a lot easier to actually like read the code base, and I really like how the API is designed. But then you get some other stuff that you would get from Celery, or like a more comprehensive package there. So once again, it's kind of like what are you starting with? Are you outgrowing things at some point? But it's super simple. Just uses Redis as the task store. And I didn't have to set up anything, like a RabbitMQ and things like that. So yeah, it's working pretty well for that.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Like if that works for you, then there's really no reason to switch, right? I actually have not used that library. Does it support like periodic interval tasks? Like I want to run this every day at 2 a.m., stuff like that?
Yeah, you can do that too. I think one issue that I ran into was you can tell it to retry tasks if they don't get processed, but then if you exhaust the retry limit, let's say like some external service goes down, and eventually you've like exhausted your retry limit because you're just telling it like, hey, retry this 10 times and wait 5 minutes in between. It's just going to drop the task. and I haven't really found a way yet to make tasks more persistent. So for some things, I had to build, had to build like a database table for it and be like, okay, if we get this webhook, we're going to store it here and we're going to make sure this gets taken care of. And so initially, when I started, I was like, oh, okay, I can just rely 100% for the background task processing. I can just rely 100% on something like Huey. But again, like I think it's more like an architectural decision at some point where you're like, okay, stuff that actually absolutely has to happen, maybe it should have a database row and maybe it should be represented in some way so we can audit it and make sure it actually worked. But I feel like I worked with Celery in the past, and I feel like it was better at that kind of thing where you could inspect tasks and there were some admin features and you could actually take a look at what's been processed and what's not been processed and restarted. And so I think that's kind of what I'm missing a little bit from Huey. Yeah, maybe there's it's easy to switch to a different thing there, and it's gotten me this far, so that's not too bad.
Yeah, no, I would say it's definitely successful given, you're not running at like Google scale, but I mean, you're dealing with millions of page views. Like there's a lot of traffic going to your site.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah, it's been, it's one of my like nightmare scenarios is when the website goes down. So I want to definitely avoid that. And being the sole developer, all those like alerts are going to me, and that means I have to get up in the middle of the night or like when I'm on vacation or when I'm somewhere and the website goes down. That could cost me a day, and like it could potentially be a really annoying situation, and not it's going to be annoying for me, but it's also going to be literally annoying for hundreds of thousands of people, which is a scary amount of responsibility. I mean, we're talking Python tutorials, right? Like as much as I'm sort of like obsessed with that stuff, and I think it's super important. There are more important things in the world. Like it's not like a medical emergency if our website goes down or anything like that. But at the same time, I really feel like a big responsibility for the site to be up and be accessible. And so I'm like always trying to err on the side of having infrastructure and having a setup that is stable and is easy to maintain and doesn't require like a lot of like arcane stuff to keep it up and running. Like I'm super happy when Heroku sends me an email and they're like, hey, there's something happened to your database there, so we switched it over to the primary, and we switched it over to the follower, and we're like rebuilding the primary, and then I get an email from them like 10 minutes later. Okay, we're back. Like you took a hit in performance, but it's all good. Because if I had been running that on my own infrastructure, it would have been me like SSHing into this thing, seeing if I can restart it or like figuring out what's going on. And I'm like very happy to pay someone else money to take care of that stuff for me. Yeah, for sure. So you talked about like getting error reports sent to you and stuff like that. Are you using any third-party SaaS tools for that? For like logging metrics, error reporting? Yeah, so I'm using a paper trail for just storing logs, and then there I have some alerts set up that pull out stuff from the logs. So if there was some trace back or something, I would get an email. I also would get it in Slack and then through that on my phone. And then for uptime monitoring, I'm using a tool called FreshPing. And they'll ping the site, and then I also get a report on my phone via Slack. So I've been basically been piping everything into Slack, and then have the Slack app on my phone, and then have notifications for that channel enabled like 24 hours a day. And I feel like that's a pretty good setup. I mean, obviously then the downside is, okay, what if, I don't know, AWS goes down and then Slack goes down because of that, because they're hosted on there, I think. And so then your monitoring breaks down, but can't protect against anything. I feel like I'm like always defending my choices here, but I'm hoping like it's interesting, if you're listening, to talk about some of the rationale behind it. But Nick, you let me know if that works for your podcast format. Sure, yeah. I love it when people ask questions to guests or myself or anything like that. So we'll go over stuff like that at the end. So, we'll throw out your Twitter handle if people want to tag you on there for questions. Oh, yeah, sure. But it sounds great that you have like a single source of truth for all the reporting stuff. And where do you draw the line, right? When it comes to like, well, what happens if Heroku goes down or AWS goes down? Like, yeah, I mean, it is a Python website, but it's not like a Mars rover thing. But not to discount your site at all, but I think for most people, like, you just have to like understand, and things happen very once in a while, like infrastructure goes down that you can't control, and you're going to have a little bit of downtime. Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think it's a great way to find that new, find a lot of appreciation for, these large sites that rarely, if ever, go down, and they're pushing a lot fast. I mean, I can't remember like the last time like Google.com was down, right? Or like Amazon, or like, and I mean, it must be really stressful and take a lot of effort and a lot of good architectural choices to get to that point, because it's to really get to those, like how many nines, whatever you want to have at the comma, after the comma is hard, and thankfully we don't have to be there absolutely with a tutorial website, but we have paying customers and everything, so definitely trying to keep like downtimes to a minimum. And I think that also includes, like one of the things that drives me crazy, like in the past I was using like a third-party platform to host my courses, and then every time they would roll out a code change, that thing would go down for 15 minutes and it would just like error out with like a timeout, or you would get like a 500 sometimes. And I just think like, what this is such a terrible experience. I never want to expose my users to that. So so now if we do a deploy, like the worst thing that could happen really is that someone is getting maybe like a 5 to 10 second delay on that particular page view, but it's going to be completely seamless, and it also allows me to make changes to the site without worrying about giving everyone a bad experience or having like a huge downtime there. And so I think that sort of thing really has a big impact, because if it's every time I deploy, if I have to take down the site for 5 minutes, that would not really fly. I think that would be a super annoying experience for our readers and viewers. And so yeah, I think that definitely has an impact then, but hopefully nobody would really get injured if the site is down for a couple of minutes.
Right. No, yeah, for sure. When you're dealing with like paying customers, even like 30 seconds or a minute of downtime, someone just hops on in their spare time and they're like, I want to watch this video now because that's the only time I have. It's really important to keep things up. You mentioned payments. So what type of payment gateways are you using?
I am using a payment gateway, or it's actually a reseller. They're called Paddle at paddle.com. And so what they do, they take care of all of the tax obligations as well. So you're basically buying like a subscription or buying a product through them, and they will remit the taxes to all of the local governments. With like the EU has a digital value added tax, and it will send people like a proper invoice, and also give them a way to either not have the tax or get it back if there's like some special exemption rules that they have. And this stuff is just so super fractal, I think, because so many countries or legislations, they're starting their own programs there. And I was like, this is going to destroy me if I have to build this on top of Stripe and then get people to write invoices. And so I've been quite happy with Paddle, especially for their subscription flows, and they have a really super responsive team there. And yeah, that's the service that I use. A similar service is called FastSpring, that I'm still using for some things, but essentially trying to migrate away from them, because they are like very much the opposite, not so responsive, and I feel like there's nothing really happening. Like this it's just kind of static. There's no future development. But yeah, Paddle. I'm using Paddle.
Cool. So you don't need to get into like how much revenue you make and all that stuff, but I've actually never heard of Paddle before. Do you know offhand like how much they take extra compared to Stripe, like per transaction?
I mean, all of this stuff is negotiable, right? So they're a little bit more expensive than Stripe. So I think if you have like the base fee that Stripe has, and then maybe add like another 1 to 2% for Paddle to process the taxes and the invoicing and all of that stuff. So yeah, that's about the extent of what the price difference is. Yeah.
So that's not too bad, because Stripe is like 2.9% and then like 30 cents for every transaction. But, if Paddle is like, 5% or something, like 2% more basically, that seems like a pretty good deal not to have to deal with all that tax garbage, I
mean, for not going to jail?
Yeah, for not going to jail, and also like drain your soul.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I mean, to me, that stuff is very, very annoying. And I'm sure it's for, anyone who has to deal with that stuff and like get the taxes remitted and whatnot is annoying too. But it's just a great way to get bogged down. And so I look at it more like, okay, if I had to employ someone basically to help me with bookkeeping and do all of that stuff, that would probably cost more than this extra fee that I'm paying there. So I think it's at the end of the day, it's always like a trade-off. Like, what could you do, or could I spend 20 hours a month to do that stuff myself? Is that going to be more or less like the 2% difference, right? And so I've always kind of been leaning more towards, okay, I'll get a service that takes care of that. And there's things, there's services that plug into Stripe as well. Quaderno, I think, is a good one, especially for the European market. That can do that as well, but then remitting that tax to the local governments is still on you. So I would have to go and okay, so we have like $15 here go to the government in Poland, and then $15 go to France, and I think that would just drive me crazy if I had to do this like once a quarter or once a year.
Yeah, absolutely. So does Paddle also support PayPal as well, or no?
Oh yeah, so they're actually they're supporting PayPal, credit cards, and Apple Pay as well. I'm not sure about the Google Wallet stuff or Google Pay, but definitely Apple Pay. I can't say a lot of people are using that. I don't actually know, but the cool thing is I don't have to. It's like an adapter in front of the credit card processor and PayPal. So I only have to deal with a single API, and I don't have to implement PayPal purchases directly, for example.
Yeah, that's almost worth the 2% on its own.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yeah, I didn't even mention that in the beginning, but for me, like the initial thought was, okay, this tax stuff sounds super complicated. It's only going to get worse, right? So I'll better get on top of this, but then, it's a huge benefit being able to accept payments via PayPal as well, and having a single point of contact there, that I can reach out to, and they have a good dashboard where I can refund orders and figure out what's happening. So I'm pretty happy with that. And obviously that's a super important piece. If you're running any kind of like online store or anything like that, you want something that's super stable. I mean, I think Stripe is the gold standard when it comes to APIs and documentation. I mean, it's just a joy to work with it. So I miss that a little bit, but on balance, it's good.
Yeah, not going to jail, not dealing with taxes is the price to pay.
Mm-hmm.
So lastly, on SaaS tools, like external ones that you might be using, what do you use for sending out emails?
I use SentGrid. So I think they're owned by Twilio now, and been pretty happy with them. So I use SentGrid, SentGrid's API to send out the PyCoders newsletter, and then also the emails from the RealPython backend. So we'll tell you about new courses and stuff like that, new articles coming out, or if you have a new comment or a reply to one of your comments. Those are all powered by SentGrid. And pretty happy with it. I feel like it's at a reasonable price. Can't complain about the delivery rates and whatnot, which is really important. And the other thing that's super important with an email API, I think, is are they how respected they are, like what their sending reputation is, because you're going to be affected by that. Like if they get blacklisted for some reason, then your emails are not going to come through, even if you maybe didn't do anything wrong. And so been pretty happy with SentGrid there, and tried some other options in the past that weren't working out so great, but that's what I use.
Right. Yeah, no, SentGrid's a solid service. I've used a couple of them, like Mailgun and even like Amazon SES for a bit.
Oh yeah, I think that's a good option too. Yeah, so what's cool with SentGrid, they have a batch endpoint where they do some templating on their end. So I use that for PyCoders. Instead of telling, so PyCoders is a weekly newsletter, goes out to about 70,000-ish developers every week. And so for sending those through the API, I didn't want to make like one API call for each individual email. And so what you can do with SentGrid, you can tell it like, oh, here's 1,000 email addresses, here's the content, and then here are some overrides that I want you to replace inside the content. I'm not sure if maybe SES does that now too, but back then when I built this thing, I couldn't really find that. And that made the whole implementation a lot simpler, because then I'm just firing off these like 70 API calls there. I don't have to worry about rate limiting or actually, making sure the emails go out to everyone right around the same time. And I've been very happy with that feature in SentGrid.
Nice. So we covered quite a few things: payment gateways, error reporting, email. Are there any other third-party SaaS tools that you depend on?
Yeah, Cloudflare. So we have Cloudflare in front of everything, and that's just been a great tool. Like, I've been super happy with the features that they provide. I use it for things like image recompression. So it will detect your browser, and if you're on Chrome or Firefox, it will send you a WebP version of the same image, for example. If it originally was, let's say, a JPEG or something, they can recompress images and reduce the delivery time if the recompressed image is smaller than and it's a special feature in your browser or special format that your browser supports. You get that specific version, whereas I internally just have to deal with a PNG version of this image, or like a high quality JPEG, and then they will take care of that. The actual delivery, they also do HTTP2 in front of everything. So if you have a browser that supports that, which most of them do these days, you get a faster experience as well. And I also like them for their rate limiting features, because we've been getting attacked like quite a bit, where people are trying to run some kind of DDoS thing on the website, and Cloudflare has been very helpful in keeping those under control.
Yeah, that's one of the best features of Cloudflare, I think. Just some type of DDoS prevention or help against that.
Yeah.
So I guess, do you have them serving your SSL certificates also?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they also do the SSL. Well, I don't think they terminate it, because then they also talk SSL to Heroku. But I have my the certificate set up through them as well.
So how does that work with Heroku? Like, are you running... Well, actually, we didn't even get to this, but are you running gUnicorn or uWSGI for your app server?
I'm running gUnicorn, yeah.
And is that something that like Heroku just handles for you, or do you get to configure that?
So you actually have to configure it yourself. So the way, basically what Heroku is, it's basically like a Docker container before they were Docker containers. So not really exactly, but you tell it like, here are all my requirements that I need. I want a Python 3.7.3 environment, or 3.8 or what have you. And then they will just spin that up in some kind of internal container that they use, install all of your dependencies, and then call spawn the process that you're telling it to. So you give it a list of processes that you want spawned in different containers. So I have one that says, this is my web app, and what it does, it just runs gUnicorn and points to the WSGI application. So then Heroku is going to go, okay, I've installed everything. Like, here's this thing. We're going to boot up this container and then start gUnicorn. So you could use any kind of setup you could think of internally, as long as it talks HTTP. So Heroku is just going to take an HTTP request through the load balancer and then pass it to one of your containers by talking HTTP directly into it. So you just give Heroku a list of the processes that you want to run. So maybe a couple of background workers and like a couple of web tier or web apps, web app servers, and it's going to do that stuff for you. And so there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how this app would actually run internally. I mean, it could just be like a bash script or whatever that serves HTML, if that's possible. I'm sure it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So how many Heroku dynos and workers do you have running?
So I'm running this on 4 2x dynos, and then one worker.
Okay, so that one worker, that was for Huey, I guess, or?
Yeah, that's for Huey, and then it's just going to take care of things like, if you subscribe to our mailing list, for example, that flow actually happens on directly on RealPython.com, like through the web server, but then actually adding you to the email list, that's an API call that happens on the back end. So I use it for things like that. So it doesn't get a lot of load. Like, there's some occasional like nighttime tasks. I'm like pulling stats and analytics and stuff like that. And so that's pretty lightweight still, yeah.
But then also, like with CloudFront sitting in front of all of this, I mean, I guess that CloudFront takes like the blunt of all the traffic, right? Mostly.
So Cloudflare.
Or Cloudflare, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, it does. Like, definitely for the static images. So basically, what the web server, the only thing the web server takes care of is the dynamic HTML. Because the images, they will be cached, or like anything you tell Cloudflare to cache, they will try to hold on to. And then obviously they're going to ask your backend every once in a while, like, hey, we need this file again. Yeah, so the good news is we don't have to serve like static files or anything from the actual like Heroku server. But they are being served from there initially, which is maybe an interesting aspect of this all. So I'm not publishing like static assets to S3 or something and then load them from there. But I use this thing called white noise. I use white noise for this. And so it serves static assets from your application server, which you're not really supposed to do that, but it's actually perfectly fine if you have a caching CDN in front of it, because then the CDN is going to hold on to those images and you're going to serve copies of them for any subsequent requests. And I found that just makes deployment super simple, because I know, okay, this file is just getting pulled from the same backend, makes local testing super simple, and I don't have to have this sort of, okay, we're syncing all of our static assets to an S3 bucket or to some other server, and then serving them from there statically. And I don't think there's a performance impact either, because the like 99.999% of the traffic will be soaked up by the CDN, and then they're also going to do the image recompression and all that stuff. So yeah, pretty happy with that setup. And yeah, the thing is called white noise. That's the library's name.
Interesting. So yeah, no, it sounds like your CDN is like pull based. Like it just pulls down one image that it needs, and then it'll just cache that, and everything else is good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, actually, speaking of images, so that's where we have sort of a microservice there in between. I call it RoboCrop. So it's like our image cropping service and resizer. So I can tell it, we have, so we're doing these like pretty intricate title artworks for our articles that are all like custom designed. And I want like a really high quality experience for people there. But at the same time, if you're reading on your mobile phone, we don't want this to download like a megabyte of images. But maybe we want that if you're watching this on your like 4K screen at home. So, or like if you're reading an article. I'm using a separate app that's kind of like a microservice, I guess, in that regard, where it's an image proxy, it's a resizing image proxy, and I can just tell it to like, hey, we want this image. It's originally hosted here. Take it and then create like different versions of it, and then we can point the browser through those different versions and ask the browser to make a selection there through the source set attribute in an image tag. And that's been working quite well, and I think it really helped like reduce our load time if you're on a smaller screen, or if you have a low bandwidth setting in your browser, and the browser can also go like, okay, I'm going to go with the 400 by 400 pixel version of this image, and I'm not going to pull like the full full HD version of it or whatever.
Yeah, because I remember like I loaded up the homepage to RealPython.com, and it was like 75 trillion images of like every tutorial picture ever.
Yeah, I think I need to change that. We've kind of had this like success disaster where we have, if I say that myself, it's a bit awkward, but I'm going to say it. We have all this awesome content there, and that I really stand behind. That's really, really good. We put so much effort into it. It's like a couple of like separate like editing steps and review steps, and we're basically like publishing a magazine there. With like 2 articles every week and 1 course, and maybe sometimes some extra stuff. And I want to get this to the point where we're doing like 4 or 5 pieces of content every single week. And so now the problem is the landing page, or the home page, is this ginormous list of these massive images, and I need like a better structure for this, where maybe we'll highlight the most recent stuff and then give you recommendations based on what you looked at earlier, or like I need a different curation model there. And I've been working on some of that stuff. So we have learning paths now, and there's different categories you can browse the site by. But when you go there for the first time, it is, like you were saying, it's a wall of images. And so the resizing helped a lot with making that actually viable.
But I have to say though, at least like I didn't check it on like a mobile device, but on my desktop it was fine. And honestly, I prefer seeing 1 page of results instead of like infinite scroll, or like seeing like 35 pages, because who's going to page 29? Like pretty much nobody.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the other thing. We have a search system that's just built on top of Postgres full text search. that I think works quite well. But at the end of the day, if you're going to search, you're probably most likely just going to use Google or find us that way. And so, yeah, I've been going back and forth on this. I mean, a lot of times I think this stuff needs to be like A/B tested and analytics driven, right? What if we change the homepage? What's going to happen? Is it going to lead to more engagement, or are people going to be able to learn more if we had a different format? So yeah, I haven't really touched it, but it's good to hear your site there as well. It's cool to have all the images there. It's great if when it's not crashing your browser, then that's even better to hear.
Yeah, definitely. So just to switch gears a little bit, going back to Heroku, do you want to just rattle off maybe some, what are they called in Heroku, add-ons, I think? Like which ones are you using?
Yeah, sure. I'm looking at them now. So there's Heroku Postgres, Heroku Redis, the Heroku Scheduler, which I use for some like one-off tasks. For example, like cleaning out like old revisions of models or something. I don't have that on the background worker. It's just something that I run like once a week through the scheduler. So like what the scheduler does, it just runs like a script from the command line in your Heroku environment. And then I've got Papertrail, which is the log monitoring tool that I use. And that's it, actually.
Oh, wow. So I don't know if you're open to sharing this, but can you give estimates, or like how much do you actually pay for Heroku? Because a lot of people, right, it's like they love the idea of how easy it is to deploy, but then it's like you get that monthly bill and it's like, I don't know about that now.
Yeah. It's about $700 US, give or take. So that's not just for RealPython.com. That's also for the other stuff there. For example, I have like a staging environment for it, which is like a full copy but at a smaller scale. So it's definitely, I mean, and I didn't start out that way, but as the traffic grew, I had to crank that up more. So I think, in another universe, like if RealPython had stayed a static site, maybe it would actually be running on, something like a Netlify or something like that, where you could run this for dirt cheap and still push a lot of traffic. But since I wanted more and more dynamic features and I wanted to have the full CMS, that was kind of the trade-off there. And I am getting like more than $700 worth of value out of this setup every single month, just because I don't have to spend so much time on maintaining my infrastructure there. I think I could easily I could run this myself, and I could easily spend many hours every month, or at least sort of averaged out whenever there is something or there's like a big upgrade that needs to happen, where I would probably end up with the same ballpark number or possibly higher if you factor in like backlash of like, oh, the site was down, I'm paying for access and like now it's not working. So yeah. I'm both sad and happy about the price.
Yeah, honestly, I thought it was going to be a higher number. I mean, 700 is still $700 a month, but given what you're getting, I don't think it's that bad, especially with your specific site where it's like, I'm not going to ask you how much you make per month or whatever, but it's a lot more than 700, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, otherwise I wouldn't be paying the 700. I mean, at least I want to break even on this stuff, right? And so it's, yeah, I mean, I think that's the way to look at it, right? Like with any kind of business, you have to, think about that kind of thing. Like even I think especially as a sole developer, because there's always different options, but a lot of times I feel like it's just kind of like a market price, right? I could run this whole thing on my own infrastructure or like a Linode or DigitalOcean VM or something. But then if I didn't want to do the maintenance myself, I would probably have to pay a consultant money every month to keep the lights on and like install patches and stuff and upgrade the Linux kernel and like when there's the latest like Intel mitigation that needs to be installed, and here like Heroku is taking care of it for me. And so I look at it that way. Like I don't look at it as like, oh, here's $700 down the drain every month, but it's more like it's actually a bargain. I think if I had to hire someone to do this, if I didn't want to do it myself, it would probably be a lot more expensive than that every single month, plus the infrastructure costs. Sure.
Yeah. I mean, if you were to hire some developer in the US to do something like that with that type of experience, like that could be $100, $200 an hour. And it's like, that goes up really fast when you're dealing with infrastructure stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned you had like a staging setup with Heroku. Do you want to just like walk us through what your deployment process looks like from like DevBox to running in production?
Yeah, so I'll make a change here. I'll create a local Git branch, make a change here, test locally, and then push that to GitHub, where I'll create a pull request, and then I'll have my testing, my automated testing, run again in the on Circle CI, so in a cloud environment. So I get that attached to the pull request, and I can kind of review everything. So I pretty much do like one-person code reviews for this stuff as well, just because it's a workflow that I really like, being able to see all the changes that are about to go live. And when I'm happy with the changes there, like the change set in that pull request, I'll merge it to master. So I want master always to be clean and deployable. And I'll merge it to master, and then it'll automatically get deployed to the staging environment. So in Heroku, you can set up this thing called pipelines, which are deployment pipelines. So you can have like one or more staging environments, and then you could push versions that you're happy with out to production. And so it goes to a staging environment. So I can test it there. And then I can take that exact version and that exact sort of build with all the dependencies and everything, like think like a Docker container, and I can flip that live in production, and that's going to take a couple of seconds for it to boot up, and then that version is live. And I also get some metrics tracking from Heroku. This is the throughput, like here's the latency, here are all these things. And so if I'm not happy with the deploy in production, I can quickly go back as long as I have the proper migrations in place, or I have some code in place that can actually like roll back to a previous point in the data model. And that's been super helpful, that workflow, and I really like it. I feel like it makes me very effective, and it's also several rounds of testing essentially with more and more production-like environments. And then I can flip it live and watch the metrics and the stats. And if I see a spike and like, oh shoot, we're getting a bunch of 500s here, I'll just immediately roll back to the previous version, and then I can figure out what happened without actually affecting people's experience. And that's probably one of my favorite features there in Heroku, just having that be so seamless and so tightly integrated, especially with the metrics and the stats that they provide, has been really, really helpful.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a very, very sane workflow. And really, it's pretty tight too for one person. Like you're doing things like, by the books kind of, like all angles are covered. Like I really like that you go the style of doing like a one-person code review.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's awesome.
I think that's been really helpful, and I always have an eye on like, okay, there's going to be a time hopefully where I'll be working on this with more developers, and then I don't want to have like a mess of, oh, here like here's the zip file, like just extract that and make sure you're on Windows XP like Service Pack 7 and do a dance, rain dance for it to actually run, and like. So yeah, having that workflow in place, I think from day one is nice, and I just like having things nice and tidy there.
Yeah, so now it's like that gets us into production, and like the next step here is like as it's running in production, like do you have any like plans for disasters, like unexpected events and malicious users, even things like that? Like database backups and user-generated files.
Yeah, so I'm using Heroku to so they're keeping backups of the database, and the database is set up in a way where there's a primary and a follower. So there's always a copy. I mean, obviously that's not going to help you if somebody were to get into the site and then like delete all the data, but then I also have local copies in other places, and then. Some like static files are actually being served, or like basically dynamic static files. Doesn't really make sense, but when you upload something to the site, let's say when we upload an article image, that's not part of the code base, but that's something that's added as part of the CMS workflow, then that goes into an S3 bucket, and then that also gets served through Cloudflare. And so for that stuff, I also have backups. So yeah, I could spin the app up pretty quickly. And as long as Heroku doesn't go up in flames, it should be super quick actually to restore this thing from scratch. Like I think I could rebuild it pretty quickly. And as I'm saying, I think I should probably do this and like document it in some way, so when I have to do it, I have like a manual for it. But yeah, I'm feeling pretty peaceful there.
Yeah, no, because that's actually a good point about the images. I was going to ask you, it's like, yeah, you have all of these thumbnails and that has to be like uploaded somewhere, but S3 is the spot.
Yeah.
But in a related note, what about videos? So are you using like Vimeo or something else for that?
Yeah, I'm using Vimeo as their pro plan to host the video files and handle all the like recompression, all of that stuff. Because I wanted to make sure everybody has a good viewing experience, no matter what their connection quality is. And yeah, I think they're a pretty good solution there. I was also thinking about rolling my own. What if I built like my own little CDN that was serving us from S3 or something like that? And I think that is potentially an option for the future. But once again, if there's some kind of like browser issue or some device that doesn't like that type of video encoding, I can just rely on Vimeo to fix it, because they're incentivized to they have like tons of engineers working on that, and professionals that are that know how to do video encoding correctly. And so I didn't want to reinvent that from scratch.
Yeah. No, I'm a big fan of Vimeo also. Like their player is actually quite nice. I never had any complaints about it.
Yeah, I like it too. And then and it has a good API, so you can integrate it with the rest of your site. And been quite happy about that.
So we're kind of coming up at the end here. So do you have any like advice for others who are running similar stacks in production? Like what's your best tips and lessons learned?
That's a good question. Let's see. I think we're still in this like really cool golden age of the sole developer, especially if you're a web developer. You can do a lot of cool things with all the modern services and tooling you have at your fingertips, right? Like one person could run all the infrastructure for a fairly big site. And that's kind of magical. And who knows how long this is going to last, like, we're going to have the same opportunities like 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I don't know. I hope so. But what I want to say is, I guess, don't be discouraged by any of that stuff. And you can get pretty far just with a one-person operation there if you're comfortable with paying for services, relying on services, and finding good quality components there that you can use. So that is my very vague advice for anybody listening.
No, it's good advice. It's like trade a little bit of money for just getting your thing up, because who knows, like getting it up and out there is the most important thing, because who knows what's going to happen in 5 years.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you find success, you're going to find ways to, then you're going to figure it out. But like the worst case scenario, and I think unfortunately the most common scenario is, at least for me, the failure mode sort of was, I'm going to buy, back in the day, like I learned programming because I was really interested in games development. And I was just fascinated by computer graphics and all of that stuff. And then, when the Quake and Doom source code was out there, I was like, oh my God, like this is so amazing. And being able to read this, and like I was playing this, and I wasn't even allowed to because it was banned in Germany. And I had these like grand goals of like, okay, my first game is going to be this like online multiplayer game, and it's going to have like all of these things that were just impossible, for me to actually implement. And it was just constantly failing at that level until I realized like, no, you got to go and like make a Tetris clone and like do this other thing, like take it very, very easy, and then see if you can get anywhere, and then you can build it up and scale it, because you could very well like spend 2 years building out a game engine or some engine for your website and never actually get it out there in the world. And to this day, like anytime you go to a game development forum, there will always be that person that's like, yeah, I just got this book, and like I'm learning C++, and now I want to build like a World of Warcraft clone or something. And like, right. Yeah, this is just history repeats itself. And I think that was a good lesson to learn. Yeah,
definitely. So I guess the last one for you, it's like, what are some mistakes maybe that you've done in the past in your code base or in your deployment setup that you've kind of corrected? Like what, or maybe even like what other mistakes that you see other people making?
I think for my stuff, having that one app as sort of like not a microservice really, but like as a separate app, it was a mistake trying to split up the monolith, and I should have just kept more stuff inside the monolithic app, just because it's a big time saver having to deal only with one code base and being able to roll out API changes or internal like interfaces changes across the board. just because that's been very helpful for my internal workflow. And the company where I worked at previously, we were very much it was like a different scale, and so we ended up building a lot of things in like a microservices architecture, and it made a lot of sense for that type of setup. But maybe initially I was thinking like, oh yeah, I'll carry some of that over because obviously that's how you do things. And then I realized like, wait a minute, monolith is still the way to go if you're a very, very small team. And if you're, I think in a space, like this type of website, I think it just makes sense for it to be a monolith, because we're not like globally distributed search engine or anything like that. Like if somebody's doing that, like this different advice applies for sure. But I think that would probably be like one like architectural challenge that I brought upon myself, where I was like now I'm actually building this stuff back in and kind of have the monolith like reabsorb it. And I'm happier that way because I don't have to synchronize package versions and, have like an internal package registry and do all this stuff that you really would need to do a microservices based architecture. Yeah, I think that's probably like the number one thing where I feel like I would do this slightly differently now. Yeah, other than that, I mean, I think with a site like that, the biggest architectural decision is, am I going to go with WordPress and a bunch of plugins, or am I going to build my own or pay someone to build my own? And I was really on the fence there for a long time. And, I was actually, when I was working on the sort of RealPython reboot, I actually had like a version set up on WordPress that was using all these different plugins and stuff. And then I had this realization one morning, whereas trying to upgrade that or try out a different like code highlighter plugin, and like the whole thing like basically came to a crashing halt. And I was like trying to figure out what was happening there and didn't really understand or know how WordPress works internally. And I was like, this is maybe going to get me started a lot faster, but then it's going to be a massive liability. Like I have no idea how to maintain this stuff. I don't like working with PHP, and it kind of sucks that a big Python site is running on PHP. Like, and just philosophically seemed strange to me. And so, and I went the route of building it out with Django. And again, like I think there could be different perspectives on it. Like financially, it probably didn't make sense to do it, honestly. Like if I account for all the time that I invested into this, it probably didn't make sense. But I'm still very happy with that decision and like the code base that I have now, and how it all looks and how it all works, and that I know 100%, how every little detail of it works internally. That's giving me some satisfaction as well.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think you've done a great job on that site. And it's one of those weird things too, right? It's like if you didn't build it yourself and you just use like WordPress, then who knows where you even would be now, because it's like, well, I don't know how you do like your training material and stuff like that, but it's like RealPython in itself is a pretty big Django Python application, and you just working on that project, like it levels up your Python skills, which in turn turn into tutorials and maybe courses and stuff like that.
True. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of this is like win-win situation, right? Where you get to learn and teach at the same time. And I find all of that like super, super rewarding. That's true.
Yeah. So Dan, thanks a lot for coming on the Running in Production podcast. It was a real treat having you on the show. But before we wrap this up, I mean, do you want to share any links maybe to like YouTube channels, Twitter accounts, GitHub profiles, stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best way to find the stuff that I talked about directly and then see it live in a live environment is to just go to RealPython.com. And then you'll find lots of Python tutorials and video courses and other resources like learning paths and quizzes that you can take to check your learning. If people want to find me personally on Twitter, they can do it under @debater_org. So my personal website and domain is debater.org, so that explains the Twitter handle. But for anything related to RealPython, we're at RealPython pretty much anywhere, including YouTube. And then my personal is debater_org.
Going back to what you said like an hour ago, because this show is running pretty long, if you want people to ask you a question about this podcast or RealPython in general, should they tag your personal account or should they do like @RealPython?
I think personal is best. I also have my DMs open, although if it's like a question that somebody would benefit from in public, then I prefer to answer it in public, because otherwise I'll get probably the same question a couple of times. But like my personal is a good way to reach me there.
Awesome. Thanks again, Dan.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, and that was fun.
No problem. And on that note, to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to the Running in Production podcast. You can find a full archive of the show at runninginproduction.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe using your favorite podcast player or leave a review if you like the show.